I'm reeling in the conversation. There were about half a dozen people who left the Zoom room and immediately went into the study hall voice chat on Discord and kept that conversation going. I know Mason also started a text thread in the Discord to keep it going. So my goodness, I think we're not gonna find one answer here. So we might as well just keep the conversation going. So I'm thrilled for y'all coming back to join us for Dr. Emma McMain's workshop. I've just been looking forward to this and her framing of this since we had it planned. You know, the idea of critical SEL, not as a checklist, but embedded into authentic practice. And I'll put in the chat here too. We were talking before folks jumped on about a couple of pieces that Emma was able to publish through HRP. Just reflecting on the importance of this work, bringing in teacher voice, just really I think are good companions to this. And of course, there was a podcast that I think Emma that you recorded with Chris last year, which is not only up in our podcast feed, but I think was also a video podcast for YouTube. So we'll just post all those things in addition to any other resources afterwards, because you've just contributed so much to this work through HRP, and we're so grateful to that. I just wanted to real quick thank our sponsors. We've got Teacher Powered Schools, Learning Inspire Ed, Sokol Moran Partners. We've got STEM Punks, What School Could Be, KMS Intercultural Education, and the Lab for New Teaching, bringing us Dr. Emma McMain today. And she's going to share with us her perspective, her work, help us think about reimagining social emotional learning as authentic practice. Thank you so much, Emma, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I actually just had Chris on my podcast last week, which isn't going to be aired for a couple more months, but I was reflecting of like what a great kind of happy coincidence that was. I think it was almost 2 years ago now. It was 2023 when Chris had reached out to interview me about these thoughts around social and emotional learning, and it was a really great way to become aware of what HRP is doing. And I don't know if you had already started the summer conferences at that point, but it's been great to be looped into them. I was moving across the country at this time last year, so I couldn't join. So I was excited to be like, this year I'll actually be able to be part of this. So it looks like we have 30 people. What I actually wanted to begin with is kind of a soft start. Let me share my screen really quick. And actually, I'll share my real PowerPoint with all my little notes on there just to get us started. So, like Nick said, today's workshop is about SEL. If you are hoping to get the next like how-to or the next curricular model, this is not a good place to be. This is going to be a lot more open dialogue, kind of speculative. So I come in from the University of Arkansas, where I'm currently at as an assistant professor. So I'm much more in the academic-y side of things. I teach qualitative research methods, so I'm really interested in things like talking with people and valuing stories as data, not just like hard number data. But I don't get to spend very much time at all in K through 12 classrooms. I'm about to do a project of talking with rural Arkansas teachers about how they're experiencing SEL, but I'm really excited to learn from everybody here today. I know a lot of you are K through 12 teachers or do more like in the classroom, face-to-face time. So I do a lot of like thinking and looking at SEL and talking about it. Like I have the luxury of time to theorize and talk and hear teachers' perspectives and analyze, but I don't have a lot of time to like work with these curricula. So I'm hoping it can be really reciprocal in that way. So my soft start idea, I don't know how many people are familiar with Padlet. It's pretty straightforward as like a online bulletin boardy kind of thing. The QR code is here, and I think I have the link. Oh, that's not the right one. I'll let everybody join with that, and then as soon as I stop sharing screen, I'll throw the actual link in the chat. But this is the conference program description. I think it might be a little ambitious for today, this piece about developing an artifact, That'll be kind of an option to work on. If you want to just be more dialogue focused, that'll be another option. But I'm curious for those who are coming in, like, what is one learning objective? I like to think hope or intention that you are bringing in. Mine is very, very loose. It's pretty much think about sociality and emotionality in either a new or validated way in relation to the people we're with today. That's very loose. So if you have something more specific, I'd love to hear it. So I'll give people like till maybe like 125 or the 25 mark to throw in your intention. Yes, I'm going to stop just for a minute to make sure I don't have anything weird up. I don't think I do. And I will share the actual link to that.
And maybe it'd be helpful, Emma, only because it's been a minute since I've used Padlet. Do folks navigate to that bottom um, plus sign there and click the add post
Yeah,
with something on there? Okay, cool. Awesome. Oh,
yeah.
I see people on there. Sorry. Just wanted to make sure folks were
No, it's
getting there.
okay. Sometimes it's the kind of thing where I'm like, it's intuitive. And then someone's like, no, it is maybe your intuition, not mine. Yeah, I'm just looking at these coming in. These are awesome. I wasn't hoping for a specific thing, but I think this is going to be in line with what I'm planning, at least for the day. Some of the things too, like I saw Rebecca had put hearing some non-carceral ideas. Some of that may go beyond like what I'm planning to talk about today, but may very well come up in like some of the discussion prompts. So please feel free, like if you don't feel like I'm specifically addressing your objective, weave it into the conversation if it comes up. I feel like Zoom used to have the chat show the history of comments when you came in. I don't know if I'm imagining that, but I get frustrated that you can only see what happened since you came in. So we'll keep going, keeping this in mind. Feel free to keep it pulled up. So really quick in the chat, I'd like to get a sense of who's here today. Um, Whatever you want to share, names, pronouns. This could be like literally where you're located geographically or kind of what you're coming in with. I'll just give this another couple minutes because 2 hours goes fast, but getting some sense of who's here today. I think we are all located on the internet today. I took a place-based education course in the spring of 2020 when everything moved online, and it was a really ironic semester to be in that class. And we would often have conversations like, are we collectively in a place right now? Is the internet a place? And in some ways we were like, yes, because like we aren't in the same bodily space, but there's still like opportunities for connection in that. Okay, I recognize a couple names. Hi, Jane. Good to see you. Looks like people spread all over. Seattle. I grew up in Western Washington, so Pacific Northwest is still kind of my home base, so I love to see people from there. Okay, kind of trying to keep up. I'll keep going. And feel free to keep dropping if you haven't already put your stuff in the chat. So, what I wanted to start with is more of kind of an icebreaker in breakout groups. I thought I might put people in like groups of three. Um, that should work, three or four maybe. Of just what do you think of when you hear SEL? Not just like the formal definition, but what comes to mind, what comes to body? Is it something you've been doing for a decade? Is it something you have never done? Something you adore, abhor, some of both? Um, so I'll give you just like 5 minutes to talk with a smaller group, and then would love to hear a couple highlights when we come back together. And Nick and Chris, do you want to be like, if I do breakout groups, do you want to be put or do you want to stay in the main room? Put in? Okay. So here's 3 to 4. I think I'm going to put three per room. It says it'll be even. We'll see how that goes. 35 doesn't seem divisible by 3, but that's what Zoom is saying. Hi, Annie. I just opened breakout groups a couple minutes ago to talk about these sort of icebreaker questions around SEL. Is it okay if I just throw you into one to kind of be absorbed? Or if you want, you can stay out here and I can hear your thoughts.
I totally good to send me into one. Sorry, I had a meeting that I couldn't avoid that
Oh, no, you're
caused
good.
me to be late.
No problem. We're going to go for about 3 more minutes and then I'm
Great.
going to pull people back. Let me see if there's one that only has two. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll turn off my screen for a second so I can see people better. And then just taking a couple minutes, anyone have anything pressing or highlights from your conversation to share how you're coming into SEL?
I can share. I found it interesting in our breakout. I'm like, when I hear SEL, I have a very positive, like, it should be everything, like everything should be that. We don't need to call it SEL, but like, it's like, but it's got a really bad rap, like in the ed community right now. There's a lot of negative associations with it because probably of like the co-opting by curriculum producers and stuff. And so, maybe a rebrand or something needs to happen to get all this negativity away from it. So that's it.
Yeah.
I actually love SEL. To me, it's just how to human. And I think it doesn't matter how old you are. There's things that you can always learn how to have a conversation, how to be empathic, all of those things. I think for me, part of the piece that comes with SEL is that it's been um, kind of I forgot. I literally just had the word. Anyway, it's been taken as like shorthand for A-bar work. And I think that when admin or like the big people, right, use SEL as a way to talk about anti-racist practices, it will fail because it's anti-bias, anti-racist school practices. Um, I feel like then we're selling both things short because social emotional learning is about being a good human and anti-racist practices is also about being a good human, but they're looking at very different things through a very different historical lens and context. And I think the other part of it is that there's a lot of people in district that are just like, well, are we going to give every kid a trophy now? Like, we need to like toughen them up, and like the word rigor and all that kind of stuff come in. And I hate the word rigor because not having rigor is a privilege. Not having, so there, anyways, I can go on about this, but to me, that's what I think of with SEL. I love it, and it's been usurped and it's been tainted by people in positions of power because they don't want to do the work.
Mm. Yeah, I'm looking in the chat too. I have to say I love the like SEL good, SEL trademark bad. It's like words like usurped, co-opt. It's interesting to be in this space because I'll talk about a little bit later. Kind of what I'm hearing and seeing right now is it's sort of a forced like reductionist way to think about it, but I kind of think of three streams of conversation with SEL of like, absolutely, yes, what could be wrong with this? Let's promote it. Let's keep like pushing forward with new curricula. Then there's also like the negative connotations of like, it's a Trojan horse for critical race theory, it's liberal indoctrination, it's stepping on parents' toes, tends to be much more like right wing delivered attacks. And then there's also like, it sounds like a lot of this conversation that you're all sharing, and where a lot of my work comes in too, is the yes and or the like yes to the concept of valuing sociality and emotionality as part of learning or being, but no to some of the ways that that is happening. A conversation I frequently have and do not have an answer for is when and how and whether we actually use the term SEL because there is sort of that danger of like the minute it becomes, I don't know if acronymized is a word, the minute it becomes an acronym, it's like kind of shrunken. But anyway, a lot to talk about that I want to keep talking about. But first, I wanted to do one more little breakout group discussion, um, which is, you could kind of call it adult SEL adjacent. There's a lot of conversations right now in the SEL sphere that are promoting adult SEL. That maybe I'm curious if that's something that you all have run into, which I appreciate as this recognition that it's not just children who need to like become socially and emotionally competent. Like also adults have some introspection or some reflection to do. I think sometimes it happens with some of the same issues that you're all mentioning and that I talk about with that kind of um, usurping effect. But my prompt, I'm hoping, won't come across as a total adult SEL prompt. But I do want to spend a little bit of time thinking about like what you value. Like a couple of you right off the bat said, so like SEL should just be what we do, like it's being a person, it's being a good person. And I think there's often a lot of things with that that go unquestioned. Um, one question I often have is like, this unquestioned premise that our social and emotional worlds are up for mastery and that those can be measured and assessed and explicitly taught and monitored and managed. Like, I'm not saying they can't, but sometimes there's that leap that isn't really named of like, can these parts of ourselves be curricularized? So, feel free to throw in the chat if anyone has come across this distinction between reflection and reflexivity. It's something that I talk about a lot in the like qualitative research sense, always trying to be inward thinking and like self-aware, but being self-aware also means being socially aware and thinking about how who we are as a social product. Um, per my last bullet point, some of this depends on whether you do believe that or whether you believe like I am who I am regardless of what context I'm in. But with my next question, my challenge or my prompt is to really try to think reflexively, not just reflectively. There's no single definition of this, but I like this one at the top that to be reflective doesn't demand an other in the awareness, whereas reflexivity does. So, like, for example, my question to you all will be coming up with some of the things you value socially and emotionally. And I think it's really easy to make a list that's sort of closed for debate. Like if I say I value people being kind, it's kind of hard to, I mean, you could come up with times that may not be their best thing, but kindness or honesty, like these are really like good coded words that are sometimes hard to disrupt. But one thing I try to do a lot is think about like myself reflexively. If I value being nice, I think that's really tied to my positionality as a white woman who's been like very conditioned to be pleasant, to not come across as insensitive or rude or hurt people's feelings. And some of that could be the kind of kindness I think is radical and important. Some of it could become kind of people pleasing or feeling policed emotionally. So, anyway, I'm guessing from this group, these are things that a lot of you have spent a great amount of time thinking about. Um, and like I said, I know 2 hours is going to go by really fast. But for another 5 minutes, opening the groups again, you can either work independently on this or you could come up with kind of a collaborative list. If you had to make a list of like, what qualities do you think are important to instill in whether that's students and children, if you work with students and children, or if you don't, anybody, what would those be? And then if you do have time, starting to think about like, where do those come from? And I'm going to try to catch up with the chat a little bit while you're in there. Okay, stop the share again. One thing I forgot I was going to do is I'll throw the PDF of my slides. Oh, I might need permission to do that actually, if I can, into the chat, just so if you do forget what the question was, you could pull it up. Um, But I figure we can take now the next 10 minutes or so just to talk through some of these. I know this was a very short time to make a list of something quite profound, arguably. But to hear a little bit about where people are coming in, and then I have a little bit more kind of context around thinking about SEL critically. And then the last about half hour of the workshop will be more like creative dialogue, not just me talking. It says I can. That's weird. Yeah, it's not letting me share from my computer, but if I put it in Google Drive, I think I might be able to. So I'm going to work on that while people start sharing. Nick says what we all agreed on, it's all vibes. Can you say more about that, or anyone in your group?
I think Emily was about to go on a rant on it before she got pulled into the void from Zoom. I'll defer to her.
Nick brought it up, like, and students, I mostly substitute teach in high school. And if you ask kids what affects their day the most, it's the vibes. It's and I would say as an adult, it's the culture that the teacher creates. It's the culture that the school creates. Consistently, that's what students say make the most, like, affects their day the most or impacts them the most. It's not about computers. It's not about AI. It's not, it's just vibes. And I think the other point that Nick was making that was really important is, like, SEL is not something we do, it's how we be. And so it's like constant, right? Like the things that are part of SEL are the way that we be.
That makes me think of like kind of just the assumption that everything can be articulated. Like the word vibes makes me think of like all the things that we can't necessarily, like how do you measure vibes? Can you? Interesting. Anything else with that or any other groups? Looking at self-determination theory.
We have a big list, and I put it in the chat. I want to echo two things. The first is Ryan brought up the 5 neurodivergent love languages. So things like info dumping and body doubling, kind of leaning into that. But also a conversation was brought up surrounding um, kind of like the weirdness behind schools that require you to rate kids based on these things. So like getting a report card about how curious you are, how collaborative you are. And I would argue the same way with academic grades, that's problematic. But especially so in like the emotional SEL world, I find it to be really disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
Something I was talking about that I'm like, I'm a talker, I talk things out. That's how I make sense of things. Was just thinking about my own value system and my own experiences. And like, at what point am I impressing my value system on the children in front of me because of my own experiences? And like, because like I was using collaboration, like I come from a lot of cooperative work, like literally with co-ops, living in co-ops, eating in co-ops, working. So I have a very, like, when it comes to collaboration, interdependence, that's like my bread and butter. But if you've never been able to be in a situation where you've been able to depend on people, or you've been able to experience that, it doesn't make sense to you, or it's not part of your value system. And and part of me is kind of like, I've had the privilege to have those experiences, and am I impressing those values that I think are important on young people, when a lot of times at home they're being told, screw everybody else, take care of you, do what you got to do. And and like, where is the line, right, as an educator, when you're coming in and you're trying to instill those kinds of like humanistic values within the context of like a larger society, a larger culture, a larger, like, so it's just something that yeah, like thinking about the values that I have, and like that not really bridge, but like that kind of, I don't even want to say tension, but hopefully people understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think of like that kind of recognition of like, am I just asking people to value what I value? I think it's one thing when it's like a very personal value, but it's hard when it's like a sort of system-wide value. Like I think of conflict resolution. when it's sort of like in the water of a lot of the dialogue and curriculum that teachers and students encounter every day, I feel like it becomes hard to see that as a value and not an inevitable like thing that we should all value. And um, yeah, bringing that to awareness to me always seems like not the end step, but at least an important one. I know there's a lot in the chat, but anyone else feel like sharing verbally?
I'll share something. When I was in the classroom, I really was resistant to like explicitly bringing in executive function strategies because it felt like I was like saying like this is the way you do a graphic organizer. Here's the planner to use. When so many in the real world, we all do things in different ways. However, with like the rewiring of young people's brains, like with their attention is so short now, actually completing tasks and self-regulating and managing one's time and follow through. I feel like that's a really important part of social emotional development that isn't on like the being side as much as, you know, empathy and collaborating and relationship building. And so I'm starting to be more pulled into the executive function side of things just because in self-management because I'm seeing in my own children and now in early childhood um, how hard it is, you know, for them to get anything done because they just can't focus. So yeah.
Could I uplift here for a second? Something that came up in our conversation with Kim and Emily was speaking exactly to what Ashley is saying. Like, we do ourselves a disservice and sort of create a vicious cycle in for executive function and, you know, like SEL, in the sense that we don't let kids at a certain level exercise executive function, don't give them tools in their toolkit to like self-regulate. And then what happens is then later on, we say, oh, why can't these kids self-regulate and use executive function? Well, because you didn't want to deal with it over here. Now it's a problem down here on the bend. But that requires a lot of trust in kids, building different structures and systems. Like it's a big shift. But I think, again, it at least addresses a pretty common complaint that I know educators have about kids and executive function. But they need to be able to use those muscles first before we can expect them to be successful.
Annie, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is I've been out of the classroom for 3 years, so caveating there. But when I was in the classroom, one of the things that executive functioning is not a term that translates well to my students, or at least in my experience, that was not the case. But one of the things that did help translate, and I think I have been curious about for a while, is to think less about executive functioning and more about helping students and myself and just human beings think about acting and reacting and feeling intentionally. Meaning that if I am able to notice that I'm really upset, I don't know if you can hear my toddlers in the background, but like I notice that I'm feeling a lot of things based on how they're like acting or whatever, then I'm able to make a better choice for myself, whether that is that I'm gonna ramp up my, you know, excitement, enthusiasm, etc., to match them, or if I'm like, nah, I really want to help calm down. But like I think when I think about social emotional learning, one of the things where I'm curious if it will satisfy my need to not impose my like white lady norms on other people is to get us talking about noticing the actual feelings that we're having some language to realize what the feelings are that we're having, and then being able to react and act intentionally, whether that is, you know, my intention, like trying to put myself out of, you know, what might be my like people pleaser, et cetera, all of the ways that I have been trained to act. But like, you know, if you intentionally want to get loud and reactive, that's okay if that is your intention, as opposed to that is just a knee-jerk thing that you're doing without realizing that you're going to act that way because of the way that you're feeling. And so I wonder if just the language that we use can also help students think a little bit more about what it is that they're engaging with.
That relates a lot to a couple quotes. I'm still trying to figure out how to connect my Gmail so I can share from my Google. But there's a couple quotes that kind of the gist is if there's a student who is being loud, disruptive, dysregulated, pessimistic, misanthropic, it sometimes like is that necessarily um, an alarm bell that they need to be intervened or that they need to downregulate or that they need help or that they're in crisis? And being like, well, sometimes yes. And it's making me think of what you just said, Annie. Are there times that it's not like that being dysregulated is actually like good for them in that moment, or maybe good for more than just them as well? But it's hard questions because I think again it's easier sometimes to think, well, conflict resolution is the goal. Why would we not want to resolve a conflict? But to ask that question, like, is there a reason you don't want to resolve this conflict right now? Yeah, is it Zishan?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Zishan. Yeah, I think a weird thing to notice is a guy who doesn't work in schools, but it's like, oh, hey, legally, your kids gotta go to a school, and if you don't have your own choice for money, they're gonna go to a public school, and it's like, great, I had to go to work anyways, right? We saw that attitude during COVID. And then you have it, and then for me, right, as a guy who got the free lunch and the school buses and the speech therapy and the outlet of recess to like process traumas, to help cross the midline, to do the writing, to do the iterative best practices. And now it's like, oh, whoops, sorry, you didn't know that this kid who was just like a class clown or something had these things. But your social emotional learning processes of like, 2004 and now help a kid get in a better space to learn, right? But then you put in the kid in a better space to learn, and it's like, oh fuck, you helped me process the trauma, and now blank because I am just an adult in an 11-year-old body with an 11-year-old brain, but I'm gonna hold on to this forever. And now, whoops, you're my trusted adult. Please help. And it's like that's a lot of ask to do in a country like we're not the only country on earth, right? This country is America, and this America country does not have great community. Like my parents are from Mexico and Pakistan. The technology there and the water there, not that great unless you're in Iowa. The water here is cancerous. But if you're in those other places, I would say maybe their community scale, the community metric is there in Mexico and in Pakistan in certain ways, and it could be better. But in here, it's like, you know what? We'll just have the teachers. We'll have the public ed system be the trusted adult. And now it's like, I was just here to teach math, man. I was just here to teach math. And I see it in all the Friday night, like drinks after work teachers do. And I'm like, y'all are really drinking like nurses do. Y'all are really looking for a break. Like nurses and some other like loser job. Thank you for propping up capitalism like dishwashers and shit and bartenders. Like that sucks. It's a lot of work. And I can say like, oh, I appreciate that, but also just navigating the nuance of like, I do IT and I get paid more than an hour than a bunch of teachers, and I don't have any near difficulty doing this stuff. And that's also a social emotional job. The person who needs to consult, I'm consulting with someone, resolving their issue, and it's their frustration at not knowing how to work these systems. And you're in classrooms teaching kids like this is how these systems were supposed to work. And they're like, now that you're teaching me this, why doesn't it work? Why is the president breaking the law? Why are the concentration camps happening again? And you're like, you know what? You had that class 2 periods ago, and you're still mad about it. And you're right to still be mad about it. But now we're supposed to learn about calculus, and I need to have everyone else learn calculus. And now y'all are doing in your free time these conferences. So it's like that's what I see. It sucks that it's political. It is political for Iowa personally. Iowa and the last superintendent and our governor had the beef, and our district is suffering it now still with our new superintendent. Like, let's not skip politics. I know you are also the political system, the public sector, so that sucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mason?
I was just gonna make the point that having those different spaces as opposed to like and space for students to have like to work through those different emotions is super valuable. And school is not structured in a way that is conducive to that.
Yeah, I'm gonna plug their work later on, but and some of you may have heard already about Dina Simmons' work with SEL or Sierra Kaler Jones. There's a piece that I have linked in my slides from Patrick Cariaga and Stephanie Cariaga, that are all saying, like, if we are basically telling kids to breathe through oppression, that's not solving oppression. And this is a really, it's an overused example because I keep using it, but it's such a powerful one to me because I can't get it out of my head. It came from Cleo Stern's 2019 book, which is also linked in my slides, critiquing social and emotional learning from psychodynamic and cultural perspectives. And she did a lot of ethnographic work in a kindergarten classroom and observed how teachers were really held to a lot of accountability for teaching second step. So, as a lot of you know, a very prescriptive lesson by lesson type of SEL. And the lesson for that day was belly breathing. So, a strategy of how we calm ourselves down when we are emotionally overstimulated. Nothing wrong with belly breathing. But what happened was that one of the students, she had asked them for an example of a time they felt sad. And one of the students, a 5-year-old boy from an immigrant family living in New England, raised his hand and said, I felt really sad last night because my house doesn't have heat right now. It's very cold in New England in the winter. And I was so cold, I was shivering. There were holes in my blanket. And the teacher, who's a first-year teacher, feels heavy pressure for accountability, says, well, what can we do? We can belly breathe. And just this moment of like this social and emotional injustice that this 5-year-old is voicing totally subsumed into the flashcard. Um, and I think Cleo's like reading that, I try not to demonize the teacher, but we can see, like, I always think of that as such a like kind of case in point example of what damage SEL is doing by what it's ignoring or what it's displacing. So yeah, I'm resonating with a lot of what y'all are saying. Yeah. Grit, there's some, yeah, I don't have the link right now, but there's been some good pushback articles against grit of like who has the privilege to be gritty and who's recognized for grit. And yeah, Anna?
Hi everyone. This is Anna Donnell. So I just jumped in late, but I really am glad I jumped in at this perfect moment. I just wanted to offer something to everyone. So I'm an educational developer at the University of Cincinnati. So I work in our Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. So we support faculty in enhancing their teaching, doing research on their teaching, incorporating new ideas, communities around teaching, all of these things. But I also have 2 kids that are in public Montessori school, and I also teach as an adjunct in chemistry. So I'm coming with like 3 hats to this conference. But one thing I wanted to offer just about this conversation about this kind of trying to use more plain language when we're talking about executive functioning, when we're talking about some of the harms that have been caused by SEL and by grit and some of these other terms. We created this workshop called What Do I Do in the Moment for faculty. And this was, a few years ago when we could be a little bit more flexible in what our workshops could be about, I'll say. And it was a primarily DEI focused workshop. And when we think about getting faculty together to learn about new techniques, we're often thinking about faculty coming together in small groups and doing a case study and coming to consensus about like, what is the correct answer? Like that is sometimes the approach that a lot of people take. And so for this workshop, what we really tried to focus on, and I just saw Monique like shake their head like, no, it's not consensus. What we really tried to focus on was, here's the case study. Like here's a hypothetical situation that happened in the classroom with your department head, with your colleague, with a student in your office. First, read it. Second, what is your personal gut reaction? You don't have to share it with anyone. Third, what is your personal response of what you might do in that situation? And then the third thing, third or fourth, whatever step I'm on, was getting into small groups and then having a discussion about it where it wasn't reaching consensus, but it was more of what do I feel comfortable as a teacher, as an educator, sharing with my colleagues to help me process what I might do in the moment in this hypothetical situation. And that whole framework and structure, we've been thinking about how to adapt it in other situations. But I feel like a lot of this conversation today about just talking about executive functionings, talking about SEL, talking about grit, like carving out time and space where students are coming with a holistic mindset of all of these things that have happened in the day and in my life and in the world, but you're also have to like teach at the same time, that I think that process might be helpful to kind of think through some situations that might come up this school year.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to carry kind of all of these strands of thought forward, and these may come up too as we keep discussing. I do have a couple more like thoughts to plant. I have a quick timeline to show. We can think of this kind of maybe iteratively building on all of these good points. And Anna, you had mentioned like wearing a bunch of different hats. I wanted to share too that I've been thinking about SEL for at least like 10 years, I think. So for me coming into it, I think my undergrads, like 2013-ish kind of era, was around the time I first heard about SEL. And I was very much of like, this is awesome. What could be wrong with this? This is acknowledging something that academic only learning doesn't acknowledge. And since then, I've been asking a lot of these more critical questions, including the one I mentioned earlier, and I think has been brought up of how can we, and then like how in parentheses can we um, monitor and measure and assess these like really fundamental and inarticulable parts of being human. But I'll go back to the slides. You can't tell on Zoom, but I'm also thinking about this today as someone who's currently 8 months pregnant with my first child. And so I wouldn't say this has changed a lot of my perspectives on SEL, but it has brought a lot of new layers. Sidebar, I really just wanted to find like a regular, like my Bitmoji with a bump. I couldn't get the bump, but I could get these when I searched pregnant. And I was like, well, this tracks. So I don't know why there's no pregnant Bitmoji, but one question, and this isn't necessarily a new one, but I originally called it a brief timeline. It became more than brief, but it's in the slides. We could call it an inevitably incomplete timeline. So I'm not going to read this because it became more than brief, but I did want to orient everybody to just thinking about the timeline of SEL. This is a very public school, United States heavy timeline. It doesn't acknowledge all the ways that sociality and emotionality have been promoted as part of learning in Indigenous spaces, so many other spaces since time immemorial. But a lot of times SEL timelines will start in 1994 because this is the year that what's now known as CASEL, the Collaborative for Social, Emotional, and Academic Learning, became established. SEL as a term was introduced. And so that's kind of where our starting point is. If we think about like, okay, how did we get to this point where SEL has become both ubiquitous and usurped, to use some of the language that's been used earlier. Since then, it's of course kind of exploded. 1997 was the publication of a more formal guideline for educator book, starting with Illinois, which I know a few people I think I saw in the chat from Illinois. It became the first state to adopt SEL standards. Many states have standards at K through 12 level, and I believe still all 50 have pre-K SEL standards. So it's still very heavily seen as like a little kid thing, contrary to what a lot of we've been talking about of how like adults also need to grapple with our social and emotional selves. I think this is also an important year to highlight 2011 when Durlach et al.'s meta-analysis came out. So analyzing tons of studies up until that point. And this gave SEL a ton more momentum and credibility because it was linked to higher academic test scores and higher GPA. And it was sort of that like celebratory moment, but also questioning why was it not valued until the test score conversation came in. And then in the 2020s, and this is going to be a discussion question I have in just a little bit of how conversations might have changed, because from at least like where my finger is on the pulse, there's been a lot more like rationale for SEL since the hitting of COVID, because we can point to all the ways that youth are experiencing crisis and need SEL. But there's also been a lot of backlash, especially like the woke agenda kind of backlash, lumping SEL in with that. But if you want to check out this timeline, and I have sources just in the comments, I also want to acknowledge that this is not new. So, like, we talk about SEL sometimes as a newer thing, but I always find it really interesting to go back to like turn of the century, the 20th century. Progressive education in those decades included certain things that look like SEL. How do we promote good, strong characters through education, not just like the memorization of math facts? The mental hygiene movement, character education, therapeutic turn, a lot of this was sort of SEL coded. And we could read that as like progress has always been happening. I also, there's a lot that could be said here, but I did want to include some coinciding contexts, like the 1920s and 30s and later, and is boarding school era for a lot of Indigenous children. And I'm not an expert historically in how these conversations were co-occurring, but I do know that mental hygiene as a movement um, really drew a line between like who is hygienic and what is mentally hygienic and who needs to be saved through public education. So I think looking at like kind of the big picture, which is always incomplete, can be helpful. Anyone have anything? I'm looking at the chat. Anything else you would like quickly add or want people to think about when we look at this big picture of SEL? Wow. Yeah, 1746, going back further. Yeah. Yeah.
I've been digging into like indigenous histories and the connection of like, what you're talking about, like colonizers and settler colonialism going into areas and under the guise of like an education of some sort, right? Whether it was like Spanish conquistadors in like the early 1500s in Mexico, for example, doing this education. And I'm having a separate thing I'm doing for like, as me as a guy who is like a community member, let's say doing things around like Catholicism and like the Virgin Mary, for example, of like, hey, there was a way of teaching at that time, and they were raping and killing and torturing the indigenous peoples while teaching them supposedly about scripture. And then for the indigenous peoples, they were, following through because like the people who were teaching them were saying you're going to be punished even further. And even when you adopt these practices, so they made sense the best they could. And so for me personally, my whole thing about like, the Virgin Mary apparition with the tilma, that's like a thing scientifically there in Mexico I went to visit, right? That helped combine the stuff for them. And then now they have a new messaging. So for the SEL stuff, it's been for years, like, indigenous people here or in Canada's, like Babylonian times, like there were ancient, leaders back in the day who this is the way you did it for like warfare. You go and you collect new peoples to serve your nation. And so in the American system, we have it, and we have people who go into like education and then in the military, education and end up in the prison system, right? So we have these pipelines no matter what. There's always this argument of someone's using the right words for the wrong mission, right? And it's a matter of thankfully in education, you have something that I don't have in the private sector. In the private sector, it's like this hierarchical thing, top to bottom. If the CEO says it, it's done. If the president says it, it's done. You all have PLCs, you all have PDs, you'll have this iterative, constant, continuous learning process and like building a culture, because a culture is only built through friction, right? The flattening of things, right? Like the AI said, the flattening of culture is to make this monoculture that none of us feel like we have a say in. I mean, I love crypto and technology and AI like potentially. And there is stuff that's been passed in legislation this year, already passed, that is way beyond my comfort level for like talking about crypto as a technology, right? they're gonna use the right words no matter what to do things or pass things. And that's everyone. That's everyone. And maybe people are fulfilling their own mission here. For public education, at least I can say there are guidelines, there's Common Core, there's curriculum, there's history of it, and you can track it through like state legislation, and it's much more transparent than other industries. So I feel like, I see what you're talking about with the SEL stuff, and like, yeah, it can be, but everything can be used. I mean, they're using pro-life debates, and it does trickle down to the school system. I'm only bringing it up because it does affect your students by way of your students get pregnant. And this idea of abstinence doesn't work. And what's being pushed down anyways not allowed legally, right? I mean, that's it. And both sides can be labeled social and emotional learning because they're calling it what it is. It's like who's really pushing the message. And at the end of the day, it's your student who does interpret it as much as they want to.
I'm going to disagree on that one. Sorry. I don't think students.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a public school teacher. I also wear a lot of hats. But I disagree that it's the students who end up either taking it or walking away. Like taking it or just not absorbing it. I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which you also hold yourself and the values in which you bring to the space. Um, every classroom is its own culture, its own world, its own unique like ecosystem. Um, and when it comes to like social emotional learning, I agree with it's wielded as a weapon by parties that want to control behavior in some sort of way. However, when you're talking about social emotional learning in the context of education, how I think of it is how do we, as educators, the wards of these children, those who have been entrusted to take care of other people's children, how do we guide them into becoming the best version of themselves through emotional learning and like support? So like I see what you're saying when it comes to the power piece. I'm just challenging the
No, your
black
point
and white
is totally
binary.
correct. Your points, I think the culture of a room make total sense. Back to Emma's point though, it's like you're teachers and you're not the wards of these kids. Like you're not the guardians. They have families. They have like what I believe Emma was getting into is like there does exist a boarding system, a foster system where you have the control over it, right? And you have that indigenous element I was talking about where you have the line of family separation occurs, right? Until you're that point that ultimately I wasn't saying they take it or leave it. I'm saying no matter what, they're interpreting it. And because they go back to their homes and their home structures are often that is the family system. That's the system that they're under guardianship of. Until you have these more like punitive and more like colonizing systems where there is a formal family separation. Because you get it, and again, like the homily, the lessons are done by the teachers in the classroom 100%. Like, and you are impressing it upon young impressionable minds 100%. But until they have that separation where they are like, like other systems historically belonging to the school system, they do go home at night and they get to bring what they've interpreted back home.
But they do the same when it comes to coming to the class. So like I feel like the thing is that it's like the separation of both home and school is part of the problem because there's a siloing. The fact that there isn't a community approach is part of the problem. Not the fact
For
that
sure.
they don't sleep at school or that they go home to have conversations with other adults, potentially, because there are that doesn't that's not the reality for everybody. And I think that part of it is the fact that there are students whose safe place is school, and there are students whose safe place is home. And the reality of like just having the black or white thinking of it's this or that without the nuances of the multifaceted student experiences and the multiple different relationships that students can have both within and outside of the school with multiple adults is what I'm pushing back on because it's the community. Like We all know it takes a village. There's a beautiful story in restorative practices that always asks, and how are the kids doing? And how are the kids? Because if you know, because that answer speaks to everything, speaks to the economy, speaks to food security, speaks to everything. So to me, it's the thing of what are we doing to open the door to allow community into our classroom and vice versa. Because unless we invite parents into our classroom without fear of being threatened or fear of being called out or fear of whatever, of losing our jobs, then like, do you know what I mean? Because
Yeah, no,
whatever
100%.
values they have at home, they're bringing to school.
No, I agree, and you're so
Values we're
limited.
taking
I
at
mean, the thing
school,
is, you're so
they're
limited
taking
in
home.
what you can say and teach, and you mean no faith, no politics, and all this stuff for sure. You're limited, but there's also the disproportionate responsibility this current country and system we're living in puts on teachers to do those type of lessons. I agree with that 100%. And some people like me have the privilege of, even though shit's fucked up at home, your mom gives you lessons, your dad gives you lessons, and your dad looks like financial lessons, your mom looks like religious, and both have, and you're 100% correct in everything you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with any of that. And the parent community involvement, you're so right. Parents need to be doing more involved stuff, and teachers, like the Iraqi speaker spoke yesterday about, not being just like, these are the expectations of my classroom. I mean, your points are all correct. It's just such that the disproportionate amount of labor to do this, like how to live in a society, not how to do math, like how to be a person who's culturally competent and shows up for the Iowa Workforce Development and the Pennsylvania one and the Florida one, saying this is what we need our future workforce to look like. I mean, you're 100% correct. I don't think anything you say goes against what I was saying. It's just like the cultural shift and exchange could be much more greater there. Yeah. And sorry, like you are overloaded and the parents are overloaded. And if people
So
sorry, go ahead.
I also want
I'm
to
not overloaded personally. So like,
Okay, I mean the public system educators are, yes. You're not great.
sorry, Emma, go ahead, go ahead.
I don't, it's always tough. I want to, like, this is an important conversation to have. I also want to make space if anyone
Yes,
else wants to
please.
jump
Sorry.
in. And I don't want to like also do the thing of like, oh, we're all saying the same thing. Because at least from what I'm hearing, there are some different things that are being said, but I also think also it can be like I'm thinking of a lot of tensions of like the two things at once that like Monique, you were saying how I think COVID showed this too, as much harm as public schools can do and have done for a lot of kids, they also have been such a space of sanctuary or meals, at least for now, in some spaces. Um, at the same time. So it's like that. I feel like it gets so tricky when all these things can be true at once. Anna, yeah, anyone else, feel free to join in.
Yeah, this is Anna. I guess like maybe this is just like a giant can of worms question that will not be answered today. But I guess what I just keep coming back to is thinking about this concept of both and like the it depends.
Yeah.
And how like so much of what we're talking about right now is like so context dependent and so dependent on like an individual and their identity and their personality and their positionality and the culture and like all of these things. And personally, I find it really challenging to try to figure out how to like help other people like kind of wrap their heads around like there may not be a perfect answer. Like there may not even be a gray answer at this point. Not like you're never going to get a black or white answer, like a yes, no, because it always depends. But I don't even know if I can give you a gray, messy answer right now because it depends on so many different factors. So I would love if there's space here, or maybe this is something for Discord, of just to kind of think about in these really messy conversations and whatever it is, if it's about SEL, if it's about community, creating community, if it's about supporting executive functioning, if it's just whatever, like how do we have those conversations with other people about that are so many of us seek that like really practical, like just tell me ABC so that I can like figure this out and do something now. When like step A, B, and C is going to be like, I don't know, apples, oranges, and toothpaste for someone else. Like, how do you navigate those conversations?
Yeah. Emily, you want to share? And then I put in the chat, but I do want to give everyone the chance to take a break. And not just my 36-week pregnant self, but anyone else whose body needs a 5-minute break. But Emily, go ahead.
I appreciate this conversation so much. And I just wanted to throw out the idea that for me has been helpful, which is that like SEL is not something that I do to other people, but it's something I do. And then it creates a space where other people can navigate it and manage it. And you can offer tools and strategies and whatever. But because I'm doing my SEL work, then that, like if we maybe if we stop thinking about it as something we're like implementing and doing to someone else and helping kids, like, yeah, the kids have family systems and all of these other things, it's going to look different for them. And so if we think about it as something we do ourselves and not something we're doing to or for other people, I don't know, it helps me just like think about it differently.
For sure.
Yeah, it's like the oxygen mask in the airplane. Put on it, like you put it on yourself first, and then you help others.
So I just saw a good question in the chat too of like what this can look like. So let's I want to give us the 5-minute break, and then I have a couple like thoughts to share on a slide, but they kind of weave in with what we've been talking about. And then I do want to spend at least like 20 minutes or so going back into breakout groups to have some of that smaller discussion, especially for those that have been listening, but maybe chime in a little bit better when it's a smaller group. So I don't know if Chris or Nick, if you have your uh, folky Lord of the Rings-ish music available, or
Oh,
I
you
can like
bet we do.
Do you? Okay, want to put that on for like 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene. Thank you. There's also the like, I forget what it's called. It's a YouTube channel of like medieval covers of pop music. Yeah.
We got the
Perfect.
royalty free, so we don't get demonetized.
Bardcore, yes. Can look that up on your own.
Right.
All right, see you all back in a couple. All right. Hopefully you're all still out there. We can fold back in. Thank you, Chris. I have to say, this is one of the most like active chats I've seen in a while, and I'm trying to keep up, but I am going to, I think I can download it or save it because there's like resources being shared, and it's cool how much, awesome. Yeah, a lot is going on in the, like those margins behind the scenes. Great. Give people another minute to come back. I really like that there's not a gray answer, a full rainbow answer. I do feel like sometimes our options become like, do you want the left, the right, or the middle? And it's a very like two-dimensional spectrum kind of way of thinking about something that's actually like a nexus, a full rainbow, three-dimensional. All right. So I'm going to move back into, I have a couple more slides to share. We have about 40 minutes. We have till the 15 mark. Is that right? Sorry, Chris, I just caught you in a drink, but till the 15?
Yep, until 3:15.
Perfect. All right. So I kind of started to say like a couple things I've been thinking about lately. This one's like lately as in 12 years. This one is not as lately, but this comes up with, I think it was either something Anna said or Monique said. Several people have talked about um, how much power do we have as teachers? And I think this is what I was hearing a lot of in the past couple minutes of discussion of, again, this both and, or this like rainbow of an answer of how much power should we assume we have as adults or as parents or as educators, and to what extent do we not have the be all end all power? And I think a thing that comes up a lot and that people have even said to me, like, oh, you're going to raise a beautiful child. And I keep thinking, like, what does it mean to raise somebody? We could talk about the whole metaphor of like raising somebody up, but I've been, especially as I'm like actually becoming ready to birth a child and raise a child, I've been having a lot of like, maybe not fears, but a lot of like concerns in relation to this second question in italics. If I am so focused on raising this child with my own list of all these social and emotional things that I value and that I hope to instill in someone, what am I going to miss? And I think it goes back to this question of how much are we inflicting our own values on students? In some ways, I think of all the people that I am so grateful to have inflicted their values on me. Like, that is how we socialize. And at the same time, how do we think about it as like mutual entanglement? Um, I think, like I was thinking about, if I had to make a list, it wouldn't be hard, but that list sometimes is going to have to be disrupted a bit. So, a question to think about for this last piece of the workshop is, what does it mean to be mutually entangled in learning or being or becoming with somebody? And I think these questions are often kind of written off, at least in some spaces, as like the touchy-feely questions. Um, but I think we are touchy-feely people and we're touchy-feely species. And oh, thank you for those in the comments. Who do I want you to be versus who do you want to be? Yeah, and I think of it as like I'm also being raised. I think it might be a Mark Twain quote where he said something like, "My dad didn't know a whole lot when I was born, and when I was 18, I was so proud of all that he had learned," or something of kind of the kid's perspective of like, "Good job, mom, you learned a lot." So hopefully that's how she'll feel. And with that, what would it mean to loosen this idea that we, whether that's K through 12 teacher, whether that's anybody, must have this goal? And I think that doesn't mean that we don't hold a goal of impressing upon people or affecting people or relating to people, but um, I know it's a little bit of preaching to the choir there, so briefly, I'm curious, and we can do this as a whole group for a couple minutes here, maybe just like 5 minutes. What conversations are happening? We've already talked about this somewhat, but I mentioned my kind of like three-pronged way of thinking about it. The like totally on board, SEL, let's move forward, let's keep developing different innovative curricula, many of which are trademarked, let's stay the course. SEL is a Trojan horse for critical race theory. Let's lump it in with everything that needs to go away. Or this sort of like, yes, and SEL good, SEL through a capitalistic gaze bad, kinds of conversations. So I threw out some authors. I've even in the past coined a term, social and emotional learning for social and emotional justice. I talk about that in the podcast with Chris and with HRP from 2023, how I don't actually love that anymore because I feel like it's just new trendy labels instead of really thinking about what's happening. But I'm curious, what streams of conversation are happening in your spaces? And I think this could go with the question somebody had posed right before we went on break. What is that actually looking like? If anyone has any examples to share of like the textbook prescriptive SEL, something that's been a lot more critical or radical, anywhere in between. Oh, thanks for finding the Mark Twain quote. Yes. When I was 14. This can also be a question for breakout groups, but I'll give it another second if anyone wants to share.
I can speak from my school, I guess. So we had Dina Simmons give our first day speech for our district a couple of, I think it was like 2 years ago. So as a district, we say we are wanting to do like the humanizing education. I think it depends on the spaces. I think it depends on who you, like what individual's definition of that is. I think that people's interpersonal work defines it wherever they are. In my classroom, it's about the human. So that's the thing I can control. And my classroom is not just in the high school, but I also teach adults. So, and I teach teachers, so that's my sphere, I guess.
PBIS, Chris said. Yeah. So they talk a lot about tiers. That's something that came up with teachers I talked to for my dissertation, which was a discussion group 3 years ago now. And I found it so interesting that that language tended to bring up what I considered a lot of like kind of medical discourse of doses, where there was an SEL specialist who talked a lot about like the kids come to me and the teacher hasn't even given them their first dose of tier 1, so they're supposed to get their second dose and they aren't even equipped. And um, I thought that was very noteworthy of just the different language we use through different pieces of curricula. Mhm. Yeah. Feel free to keep dropping in the chat. We'll keep going because we got our last half hour. So I have two options from here, or you could think of as what's the word? Side quests, if we want to go with our theme of the conference. So one of them is more discussion based. If you're somebody like me that could just talk and think all day, and forgets that sometimes you can like produce something, even though that is productive. And then the second option is a little bit more of that artifact piece from my program description of if you want to actually like make something with your group or brainstorm something a little bit more tangible. So these are in the slides, which Chris, if it's convenient, do you mind dropping those one more time in case somebody didn't get them? So, because these are pretty wordy, option 1, you could spend all of your time talking about one of these questions. They're all here as like a menu. But if you want to dig deeper into one of these, I put some prompts up here. How can we avoid deficit narratives? What does it mean to move away from the skills and competencies focus? If you go back to that list you made, what happens if there's a student who's not embodying honesty or conflict resolution? What do you do? The second like menu of options is a little bit more production focused. So that could be either like a joint kind of mind map or diagram that tries to like summarize some of these themes or pieces about SEL that we would want to see. It could be taking that kind of empathetic approach. If you were told that you had to be in a semester-long SEL program or curriculum, what would that look like? Maybe it wouldn't look like a step-by-step program, but starting with like, what would you want and what could that look like in a classroom? And then if there are things that you do, I think this might have come up in the chat where you're like, well, it isn't called SEL, but it is SEL. One of the concerns I have is how much time is being cut from public schools in general for art, for recess, for social studies, for science. And SEL is often actually preserved in these blocked chunks of time. And it depends, again, on the context. Sometimes that looks awesome, sometimes it doesn't, depends who. But sometimes a ton of SEL was happening at recess, and all of a sudden that was replaced by second step. So check the chat real quick. Okay, thank you, Chris. So he's even put which slides. So I want to give you all a good chunk of time, like maybe closer to like the 15 minutes. I know that's just going to be the tip of the iceberg, but 15 minutes to discuss, and then I might pop into different rooms too, and then we'll come back, share some highlights, and wrap it up. Let me check the chat just to make sure no one was like, don't open them yet. Okay. So prompts are in the slides are in the chat. I'm gonna remake the breakout group so you get to talk to new people. And I think we also had a couple people who had to leave, so now they can be more even again. All right, so 15 minutes from now, couple minutes like the the 03 to 05 mark after the hour, expect to be called back. Right. Hey everyone. Hopefully you had some good discussion and or artifact generating or brainstorming. So we've got 10 minutes. Would love to hear any share outs or highlights from your breakout group time. I totally forgot to share, and of course thought about it just a couple minutes ago, that the next slide in, which maybe you found, had those quotes that I like to think about in relation to SEL. One of them I wrote of getting at this idea that we talked about a while back of, is it always a negative thing if students are not immediately addressing a conflict, et cetera, et cetera? So those could be kind of back pocket quotes for later. But to open it up, anyone want to share? Sounds like Kim and Victoria had good discussion.
I was just gonna say I'll jump in for on behalf of our group, but anybody else from our group can jump in too. But and Monique, I saw you weren't in my group, but I saw you doing this. So I'm like, okay, Monique's out. No, well, yeah, actually we had quite an extended conversation about the lunch schedule for students and offering students well, or providing really, but even offering some choice for snacks for students mid-morning and for adults, because we're all human and we need that, and how important it is just to recognize that very basic need that we all have. So yes, yeah, exactly. Then we were talking a little bit too about just how SEL curricula or resources may or may not address some of teachers' SEL needs. Two things that, well, like Laura brought up the issue of like when a teacher has to talk with a parent and or a caregiver, and just about maybe something negative that's happened in the classroom, and the parent isn't sort of aware of what teachers have to do, in a community, in a classroom community, and so just how to talk with caregivers like about that. And Victoria brought up, as I mentioned in the chat there, that when teachers aren't always feeling the best about school environments or whatever's happening for one reason or another, that's not great. So, and I'll just give a shout out to Lee too, who started the conversation about lunch and just how all that plays out in our environments.
I saw a Chef and Foundation linked in your document from yesterday, Chris. Do you want to give a quick plug? I'm curious. I could click on it, but I figure I'd ask you if you could say what it is.
Yeah, I'm just a really big fan of the Foundation and the Chef Ann Project. No affiliation with HRP in any way. I don't know if we've ever had contact with them. I will give a brief shout out to Jennifer Gaddis, who's a journalist, but also has written now 2 books on food justice and like food labor and the importance of kids' lunch options. Chef Ann Foundation partners with schools via grant funding to bring in healthier options, with a lot of focus on like farm to table, like making lunch part of the curriculum in order to make it a valid part of the day, quote unquote. So it brings in funding, etc. It makes me think of a lot of the schools, including Muskegon, which I see Jen's on this call, who's investing in things like a hoop house or local gardening and having kids grow their own food. And I think a lot of schools signal to that, and that's a really good first step. But to actually have a school that is farm to table in full functionality with multiple options for kids is a game changer. And there are schools, public schools, that are doing that. And it's an important part of the day. The food we eat matters. And if kids are eating great food, that they're going to be a lot healthier and happier. That's gonna be a little bit better perhaps than watching a 30-minute video about being compassionate.
I'm trying to find a link. When I think I was in 7th grade when it started, we started a program called Food for Thought at my district in Friday Harbor, Washington, which is on San Juan Island, very small community, but totally transitioned over from the like packaged kind of industry purchased food to a lot of farm to table with local chefs. And I don't know the financial like backstory of that, but it was a game changer. Some kids still grumbled like they missed the old lunches, but it was, and they'd do like community dinners once a month. I'll drop a link if I can find it. Oh, Leah, you know it. Yeah. Any other highlights? Things you talked about or made?
I'll share real quick. We also kind of talked about the need for teachers to be thinking about and cultivating themselves, and if they're going to model the types of being that we want our students to take up. There's a quote that I'm really obsessed with from Maxine Green, is dropped in chat. A teacher in search of his or her own freedom may be the only kind of teacher who can arouse young persons to go in search of their own. And I always want to be careful to not like lean into the very frankly like gendered way of like teaching is a calling and it shouldn't be about money or labor and it should just be about the love of the children, right? And how that kind of gets co-opted. But I also don't feel great about the idea of thinking about teaching like just as a job, right? Just as like a form of labor and nothing else. Plug for any philosophy nerds, The Good Life of Teaching is a book by Chris Higgins that's really awesome. That got me thinking about this a lot. And instead like thinking about education as like he talks about like a process of cultivating a ripeness of self. So like how can we see teaching as like a deeply like ethical and foundational part of who we are, not like being a teacher like at PS 1 2 3 and here are my classes and my bulletin board, but like like an educator, being involved in like the cultivation of yourself, and through that cultivation of self you're also able to like cultivate that ripeness in your students. So I thought that was really meaningful for me to kind of like think about and voice out loud, because I think when students see teachers who do that, it creates the conditions that allow those like SEL lessons to really stick. I've had students who are like, Dr. Elliott, it feels like you like what you do and you want to be here, and that's really helpful for me as a learner. It's depressing how often I think that kind of thing comes up, but when students can feel like, and that's not to discount the understandable tensions and stresses that all teachers have, but if students can feel like you think what you are doing is worthwhile, I think they're much more likely to learn, whether it's grammar from you or to learn how to, do breath work. I think all those things kind of fall into line when they feel like there's a person doing those things who sees their value, and wants to share them with others.
Yeah, totally. I know we're down to the last couple minutes, but that's a great point to end on too, I think. Of it sounds like such a, I guess, kind of low bar in some ways to find value in what you do, but I think as a student, as a teacher, it definitely does make a difference. I've had comments of that too, of like, it just seems like you really like what you teach. And sometimes I think how sometimes you're put into something you truly don't really want to teach, but self-directed education too. Yeah, that it's all related. So we've got a couple minutes left. If anyone wants to keep using the chat, I always love to hear like one thing you're leaving with, a thought, an insight, a tension, a quote. Otherwise, any last thoughts before we break? In the slides, I did include, these are like more formal references, but also some links to Dina Simmons' organization, Liberate Ed, Transformative SEL, which is kind of an offshoot of CASEL. So it's a little bit more kind of popularized in a little bit more of a mainstream way, but doing some very equity focused work. And then my kind of small backyard podcast project, we're in the process of getting a new logo and kind of giving it a bit of a reboot, but we have a lot of conversations on there, my colleagues and me. So yeah, good. I'm gonna have to check out the Discord. It sounds like after sessions, a lot of dialogue has been continuing on there, which is always awesome. I'm hoping to get on there tomorrow as well. So my email's in the slides if anybody wants to follow up about anything, but thank you all so much for being so engaged.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. Appreciate you being here. Thanks to you all for joining us. As a heads up, we have one more formal session today at the conference. It's in the same Zoom room, so feel free if you want to pop off of here, if you want to pop back on, however you want to do it. But we'll just keep the room open. That starts at 3:30, aka in about 15 minutes, with the Great Plains Action Society, which is a really cool Indigenous student group. So they're going to have a bunch of students talking about their work to re-indigenize/resist current ongoing practices. It should be quite radical in the coolest way possible. So I'm pretty stoked for it. So feel free again to stick around. Otherwise, I'm going to put